the contract doesn't issue. It's just that the application that you submit to get approved sort of becomes the contract. I don't think that's a terrific idea. I think it's less clear, and most things that are moving away from it. Let's talk about innovation in charter schools, and note that I put a question mark there. There are probably an endless number of ways that a curriculum could be innovative. There's nothing special about a charter school being able to innovate. I mean, any district school could put in place a curriculum that focuses on any particular area that I put up here. Charter schools often have a very specific academic focus. I sometimes worry that it can get to the point of being gimmicky. There are sometimes people ask, well, what's the charter school's hook? I'm like, well, I don't know. How about they serve kids really well in an area that doesn't have a lot of good public schools? That might be enough innovation for me. And I will say, as an aside, if you read through the charter school laws across the country, pick up my book and flip through, you will see in the preamble of just about every law that we're doing this in part to drive innovation. But if you were to ask people who've been doing charter schools for 20 years now how important they think innovation is, most of them would say, it's not the primary thing. What we need to focus on is doing right by kids who otherwise are not thriving in schools. And if the innovation is that we are absolutely committed to that, a lot of people will be comfortable with it. So I think it's something that the charter schools are going to wrestle with. How important is innovation? One frequent innovator, well, I can call it innovation, but again, you may see this in traditional schools as well, is extended learning time, whether it's an extended school day or extended school year or both. You see, one defining feature of a lot of charter schools is their culture. You walk in the morning and you see that this is a very different sort of culture than maybe what you're used to looking at. Sometimes it's more regimented, sometimes it's more holistic. Whatever it may be, the idea is that the culture drives achievement. I remember talking at one point to a guy named Dave Levin, who was the founder of KIP. And he came and talked to one of my classes, and he said that it's 100% about student achievement, and it's 100% about culture. Which I think was an interesting way to think of it. High expectations for everybody. It's supposed to be the approach. Often the environment is more structured and more disciplined. Sometimes you walk into a charter school and you think, this feels a little militaristic to me. This is very good. Do I want to, often I have found myself asking, do I want to send my kid to this school? Even if the scores are off the charts, I don't know. There's a separate consideration in terms of that sort of culture issue. Sometimes we see additional pay for students based on performance. Sometimes we see contracts with parents that say, all right, I understand, I'm enrolling my kid in this school, I promise I'm going to show up and stuff, I'm going to make this homework, I'm going to whatever it is they do. As a lawyer, I always have to point out, you know you can't enforce that, right? You can't say, we're barring the door to the public school because you didn't make the homework. But we want to send a message. Sometimes the programs have some variety in terms of the age of the classroom and other sorts of different. I couldn't list all the different things that development. So that's it in terms of background. There's much more that I could say, and I think that the report that's going out today does a good job of assessing and laying out a lot of these issues. Let me focus for a minute on what I think some of the key roles are. I mentioned before the governing board. I really think the governing board is crucial for a charter school, and often is something that is not very active. And that's a problem from my perspective. The governing board is being given the responsibility to carry out the charter and to give kids a strong education. And if they just defer that to a management company, to a principal, then I think they're not doing the job. The governing board should not micromanage, but it has a crucial role to play. Nonprofit corporations. What I mean by that is that most charter schools are considered to be both a public school and a not-for-profit corporation. So they would, in many places, function as a 501c3 nonprofit organization at the same time as they are also a public school. Just to make it really complicated, in New York, where they are both, law recently allows you to combine the nonprofit corporations together. So you could have a situation where you have 8 charter schools served by the same management organization. That is one corporation. So they have one bank account, they have one board, but they have 8 schools, each of which is academically held accountable. Again, that creates opportunities, but it also creates incredible complexities. It's good to know. ESPs, I mentioned before, management organizations. Charter support organizations, it sounds like you already have one in Kentucky, even though you don't have the charter schools. Am I right about that? You have a charter schools association? I thought I heard a reference to it, sort of, kind of. Yeah. Well, in just about every state that has a charter school, they have some sort of an association that helps support that, provides resources, provides advocacy, and they are a player in the landscape. Let's drill down a little bit on authorizers, though. Not all stakeholders are equal. The authorizer role is a unique one in terms of other aspects of public education. The entity that holds charter schools accountable is an authorizer. In some states they call them sponsors. In Ohio, they're sponsors. In Georgia, they're sponsors. They have the responsibility to create and oversee charter schools. They have to make initial approval decisions. They need to make decisions about what happens at renewal. Are we going to close the school down? Are we going to give them a little bit of wiggle room? Or are we going to approve their full renewal? There are different types of authorizers. It's one of the reasons the charter schools are kind of a spectrum, because when you make a broad reference to charter schools or even to charter school authorizers, you really got to know what you're talking about in terms of the state, because it varies tremendously. In many places, it's the district and only the district that can authorize charter schools. In some places, I mentioned a couple states here, in some places it's a district plus some statewide entity that's going to serve that function. Charter school watchdog groups like the National Association of Charter School Authorizers think that the most effective model is to have districts plus one other statewide entity that folks can apply to. In some places it's the state education department that does the chartering. If it's only them, that can be a pretty big geographic responsibility. New Jersey, for example, is the only authorizer, the state's the only authorizer, and New Jersey's not a very big state. But they have about 100 charter schools. It's not that small a state, top to bottom, and it becomes a challenge to do the oversight. You might find that a college or a university is a good way to handle authorizing responsibilities. In a bunch of states we see that. Probably the most popular one lately is the creation of a statewide chartering board that does nothing but handle authorizing issues. And that means that they have a statewide scope, but it also means that they have the opportunity to develop expertise. One of the problems with charter school authorizing is that there's often a very limited amount of resources and a limited amount of expertise among the folks who are doing this work. So if you picture a district, I don't even know what state, so picture some big western state that has 10 charter schools and an authorizer that has 2 of them. Well, that's not enough work to create a charter schools office. It's probably not enough work to even create a job title that's exclusively charter schools. So you may have this oversight responsibility being handled by folks who have other things to do and don't have the luxury of developing a lot of expertise. And I can tell you, having been a university general counsel of a chartering office, it's a huge amount of work and a huge amount of expertise is necessary, and resources are necessary to do it well. But most of the authorizers in the country fit the model that I just described to you. Most of them are small, have less than 10, probably less than 5 charters, and they have to oversee them with whatever resources they have. And as we've seen in the Credo study, which I'll talk about in a bit, the quality of the authorizing office has a huge impact on the quality of the schools. And so I would recommend that if Kentucky wants to go in this direction, to pay some careful attention to making sure that the authorizing function is one that can actually do the work necessary to ensure the quality of the school. That was not a lesson, by the way, that I think the charter school sector realized early on. I think the emphasis was on, well, we have this great idea for a school, and that's what we need. We'll police ourselves. That doesn't turn out to be good enough. I don't know what universe that would be true in, but it's not true in this one. I mentioned to Susan before, I don't know where she is, that when I was an authorizer, we used to try to avoid what we call people who were applying because they wanted to hug the kids to Harvard. And, you know, there's a little truth to that folks have such good hearts that they want to do this to just benefit those kids, but without this really sort of serious-minded approach to setting rules and following them, what we get is a lot of bad schools. So the final one, in a few places in Ohio and Minnesota in particular, you can be an authorizer if you're a not-for-profit organization. This leads to a different face of the lack of expertise problem. There's also kind of a mission issue about whether our main focus is to do this as opposed to being the Heart Association or the HEC Association. ASPCA, that's a thing. Yeah, some of them are quite good, but many of them are not. All right. So where are we now? The 42 states plus the District of Columbia that do charter schools. Washington State passed their law most recently. And there are a lot of folks that are in the charter sector that have a lot of, to my mind, inexplicable energy about pull that circle all the way around. I see absolutely no value in that. I don't want to offend anybody who thinks that this is the most important thing, but hopefully we're all trying to do what's really good for kids in a particular place. And I think if a particular state thinks that it's in the best interest of their kids, then they're going to adopt it, and if they don't, then they're not. Right now, most states have used, and you see Kentucky's right there on the list. I don't know if those 8 states have anything else in common other than this. I don't know. But that's the group you're in. Charter schools are growing like weeds everywhere, and they have. If you look at the trends, it's just zoomed up. The arrows are always just going up. Roughly 6,400 charter schools now, and that's about double what it was in 2005. Some states that have a ton of charter schools: California with more than 1,000. Texas, Florida, all pretty big states. Arizona and Ohio has a lot. There are a lot of states. Virginia has 4, and it's had 4 for at least 10 years. Connecticut has a little more than a dozen. There are plenty of places that don't have a lot of them, for one reason or another. In terms of the number of kids in the schools, we're at around 2.5 million all across the country. That's about more than double. 2005. That comes out, at this point, because those numbers are a little bit old, comes out to about 5% of kids nationally are enrolled in charter schools. In New Orleans, the number is closer to 90%. That's a unique circumstance. It sounds like you folks had a conversation with Patrick Walsh from down in Louisiana. Obviously, when the storm knocked out the public school system, they decided that they wanted to do something different, and this is a product of that. But they're not the only place that has a very high percentage of kids in charter schools. In Washington, D.C., it's about 40% of all the kids in the District of Columbia. It's about the same number in Albany, New York. There are a fair amount of places that have a high percentage. Particular statistics, 61% of charter schools serve a student population where over 60% of the kids qualify for free reduced lunch, all of which is to say charter schools tend to serve low-income kids. It's hard, again, to speak generally about something that's as diverse as this, but generally speaking, that's true. And on average, charter schools tend to serve minority kids and kids who are special ed kids or English language learners. I would say it's a lower figure than the average. Now, this slide could be a series of statistical slides, and I looked around at things, and I just didn't like the numbers. I didn't have confidence in them, so I didn't give them to you, particularly with regard to, just thing like that. Yeah. Particularly with regard to the English proficiency and special ed. I do a lot of work in those areas, and I looked at a National Charter Schools Organization website, and I saw that they had charter schools higher than the national average, and I don't believe that at all. So I don't want to include numbers that I think are skewed. I think that it's depressing to me, the extent to which the sort of partisan for or against debate tends to cloud the research that's done and the assessments of what that research says. That bums me out. I think, if you go state to state, what you find, what I have found on the ground, is that many charter schools, particularly urban charter schools, often rural charter schools in areas that are heavily Black or Latino, that these charter schools serve tons of those kids. I don't know why. They serve fewer special ed kids. There are lots of ideas about that.